Welcome, everyone. Simon Rosenberg here, Hopium Chronicles, back with a really special event today. One of my most important teachers who's really been critical in helping me navigate and understand this extraordinary moment that we're all stumbling through, Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Welcome, Doctor. Welcome, Professor.
Hi.
I'm really grateful for you being here today, and I'm a big fan, as we've discussed, and as you know. And for those who are watching Hopium, who are Hopium people here today, there've really been three people that I really kind of come back to as touchstones to help me navigate all this. Timothy Snyder, Ann Applebaum, and Dr. Ben-Ghiat have been my sort of the Holy Trinity for me in the last few years. And particularly because of the way she talks about the psychology of strongmen, which I think has been really important for those of us who've grown up and lived our lives in a democracy, right, where we didn't have necessarily the experience that other countries and cultures have had with strongmen. And so Ruth, I asked you to come on because you wrote a piece a few weeks ago that on Substack that I really found to be very powerful for the moment. And it's called Both Sane and Insane: Autocratic Visions of Governance and Chaos as a Strategy. And I wonder if we could just start today with you reflecting upon that article as a way to get into what's happening here in current times.
Yeah, thanks. I'm so pleased to be speaking with you. I've also always learned so much from you. And as you know, I didn't know much about American politics in a sense. My niche has been to focus my lens on America with my knowledge of global autocracy and strongmen in hand. And so early on, when I was researching my book, Strongmen, I realized to my dismay, this was during the Donald Trump's first presidency, that his personality was, unfortunately for us, very similar. And I had known that for a long time. I had started writing about him in January 2016, that if he got the nomination if he got the presidential nomination, he would likely have a personality cult. And nobody wanted this op-ed because it seemed too weird. So the thing about this type of personality and the outcomes, as we know, are hugely different. Sane and Insane is a quote from the personal physician of Idi Amin about him. And of course, we have fewer Idi Amins with one-party states today. Today, things work differently, but the personality of the leader remains the same. And one of the hallmarks is these are people who simply don't recognize any boundaries between public and private. So if they come to power, everything is theirs. All resources, natural resources, population, bodies, wealth, it's all theirs to be exploited, possessed, manipulated. And so that's what I mean. There's no sense of them versus them being in power for the public good. They don't think about the public good. So the purpose of governance is totally different. And this is, if you've always lived in a democracy, even if you had some crooks in power, this is a qualitatively different mindset. So public welfare, public good has nothing to do with it. You're in office to consolidate power and enrich yourself from public office.
Well, and you write this. I love this graph here. The strong man has no problem building palaces and ballrooms, very appropriate, right, in his honor, while impoverishing the population, as Mobutu did in Zaire and Trump is starting to do now. When public welfare is removed as a goal, the office holder can focus on what really matters to him: consolidating power, making money, and humiliating and punishing his enemies. We've seen a lot of that just in the last few days. I mean, his humiliation of Zelensky again, for the his attempt to humiliate Zelensky and emasculate him again for the umpteenth time. In his repudiation, and this historic repudiation and humiliation that he went through last week with one of the most lopsided congressional votes in all of American history against him on something that really mattered to him. Within 48 hours of that, he both threatened to kill 6 Democratic legislators and basically started torturing the Ukrainians, for sport, and putting this outrageous deadline on for this Thursday and publicly humiliating Zelensky again. And I just try to put the events of the last few weeks in context in from your insane and insane theory, because I will be honest with you, one of the things that I talk about a lot is I talk about his insanity and his madness. And as you know, Ruth, this is not really something that is openly discussed in public discourse, right? About his lack of connection to reality, or that things that he posts, literally every single thing in his post that he'll put on Truth Social is not true or wrong or disconnected. And any help you can give us in sort of reflecting back on what you've seen in the last few weeks through the prism of which you are establishing here.
So 2 things. One is this is a syndrome. And we're just experiencing what the syndrome I'm about to describe in an accelerated manner. Because what happens is these are already unstable, mercurial people. There was, a famous quote about Hitler from someone who knew him, that he often made decisions based on the last person he spoke to. And Mussolini was constantly changing his mind. Like literally, this is the case I worked on for years. Mussolini would say to do one thing in the morning, and then the other, the opposite of it in the afternoon. That's how unstable these people are. And what happens is, we're seeing this in the States, they surround themselves with sycophants and often family members. Somewhere in Lucid, I have an article about sons-in-law, because we see Kushner is back now doing negotiations. He's been doing them for Gaza and now for Ukraine. And they have these inner sanctums. And these inner sanctums include sycophants, family members, special envoys. They often don't actually include cabinet officials or the people you'd expect to be in let's say, a situation room. And that's because of what I said before, everything has to be personal. And they're not interested in competence, they're interested in loyalty. And so we've seen all this with the types of people who have been picked, from Tulsi Gabbard to Hegseth to Kennedy. These are not competent people, and they didn't have the requisite experience needed for cabinet appointments. But they're not interested in competence, because they have to be, the strong men have to be the ones who know everything. And so what happens over time is that they start to believe their own propaganda, and they get into a state of megalomania, right? I'm not a psychologist, but this is how they get. And they believe they are infallible. And Mussolini's slogan was, Mussolini is always right. And Idi Amin had this hugely he had delusions of grandeur, as does Trump, as they all do. And so they can start to act in ways that are ultimately counterproductive for them, because they don't get any good feedback on their decisions. And this happened to Putin. And when he first went into Ukraine, he didn't consult properly with people, experts on sanctions. He didn't consult even with his own top military adequately. And so he lost more generals than, in certain periods of World War II, just in the first 3 months. Totally. And the world saw how ravaged by corruption and his kleptocracy, Russia's military was, because he didn't consult with people. And so this is going on now. We're seeing this process happen. And we're also seeing what's gone on with the special envoy. When you have a personalization of power, foreign policy also becomes privatized. And so it's all about deals among autocrats. And you're standing as a country, we see this with Trump and the Saudis, is how much can you enrich the leader? What kind of deals are you willing to do with the leader? And autocracies are ideal partners, like the Saudis, like the Russians, because they don't have to answer to anybody. And as we saw with Khashoggi, if you do criticize, you get cut up with a bone saw. So they're perfect partners for this personalized kind of, and so it reduces foreign policy to a kind of charade. And I wrote an essay for Lucid before this revelation of this peace agreement that was probably written by the Kremlin, that it was very suspicious to me that Witikoff went there, and the whole time, all the meetings, he went to many, many meetings over months. They were always with Kremlin translators. So I called this a total charade. And what was the real business that they were discussing is unknown.
Well, what's remarkable, you just said so much that I want to dive into that. One of the things that's really struck me in the last few days, and I have been very outraged by this sellout of Ukraine and our European allies, and frankly, America itself in this effort to capitulate to Putin. These meetings that took place in Miami at the end of October that we now know about, that Reuters reported first about yesterday, where Witkoff and Kushner were meeting with Trump's emissary, who, by the way, wasn't a diplomat, but was a banker, right, who controlled the sovereign wealth fund, right? It is reasonable to assume, based on the facts that we've seen, that Putin upped the price. I mean, upped the bribe and upped the deal, and sort of created more incentive for them to come bail him out right now. And that there was, that they had whatever, to your point about the personalization, is that whatever they thought they were going to get from Putin if they delivered Ukraine to him, he came back to them and said, look, I'm going to give you a lot more. And that, because the representatives it's clear that Rubio had been cut out of all of this, to your point about this being personalized. And it just isn't easy to understand, particularly given that Jared was sitting at the table in Geneva, that there wasn't some significant financial, that they were going to get a big cut of what was going to happen. And that the percentage of that cut, the size of the cut, was increased enough to sort of spur Trump to action last week, when he was also, by the way, looking to change the subject from his public humiliation that happened, a day earlier. But it's consistent. The facts that we're seeing would be consistent with the way that you're describing this, right?
Yeah. And when I wrote the essay, and again, it was before these revelations, some people wrote to me and was like, oh, that can't be right. But unfortunately, I know how these guys operate. And I also have been predicting that Rubio was going to be cut out completely. Maybe he would be kept in on Latin American things because he's long had an interest. But this is how they all operate. And the exception is if Mussolini made his son-in-law the foreign minister, Galeazzucciano. Then he later ended up executing him. But so in that case, the foreign minister wasn't cut out because he was controlled by his father-in-law, Mussolini. But this is what the privatization of policy means. It means the country is for sale. Foreign policy is just all about deals. And the fact that here comes Jared back in there, Jared Kushner, i.e., let's empty out Gaza and make it into a Mediterranean, resort, which I will build with my Saudi partners, that kind of thing. Is whenever you see Jared, that it's not about principles. It's not about foreign policy as we understand it in democracies. So what we're doing in this conversation is also adjusting to an idea of foreign policy and diplomacy that is autocratic, essentially. It's like a paradigm shift, and it's hard to get your head around it because it's just such a departure.
Can you talk a little bit about the strongman surprise, something that you often talk about in your writing? I think it's very relevant to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, this is where, I talked about how they start believing their own propaganda. They surround themselves with people who are yes men and yes women, trusted people who go back sometimes to the old days. And these are not people who are giving them good feedback, and they don't want good feedback because they know everything, right? And so they get into trouble. They start becoming unpopular if they still have to worry about elections, and then they become more repressive. And if their back's against the wall, they will deliver what I call a strongman surprise. And that could be declaring martial law, or often, if you're already in an autocracy of sorts, you do a state of emergency. Autocrats love to have state of emergencies. And Erdogan's had an on and off state of emergency. Whenever something criticizes him or something doesn't go his way, he does a state of emergency. It could also mean martial law. And the big one is you go to war. And there's political science literature that calls these wars that are declared when the autocrat is back against the wall as gambling for resurrection. And you could see Putin's initial foray into Ukraine in 2022, because he was not doing well and polls were bad. It wasn't a good situation for him. So he felt he had to go and do this, and that was gambling for resurrection. So we're seeing this now. And Trump is the way Trump is. He's had, he was mortally offended by the No Kings successes. He didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. The Epstein thing, his back is against the wall. And we don't know if Putin has information about that, but likely he does, because Putin, that's his currency is, information. And so it's not really a good situation for Trump. And this is when autocrats do desperate things.
Well, I mean, your whole line about his perception of his infallibility, right? We did have in the last few days, his child spokesperson said, when asked about when she complained about the 6 Democrats who had done that video to remind service members that it was their obligation to follow the law. It wasn't a choice. It was their oath and their duty. She literally said, when the president makes a decision, it is legal, right? That was the line that she used, which is, l'état c'est moi, right? But the whole notion that his word makes things true, right? And this infallibility, this inability to challenge, the notion that anything Donald Trump did could be illegal, she dismissed as being absurd, right? And this sort of combining of the state and the man into one.
It's crazy. Its apotheosis was in Nazi Germany, which one of the reasons we could call Nazi Germany a totalitarian state, went beyond even a regular authoritarian state, is that at some point Hitler's will became the law. Like whatever his will was, he wanted done, it became the law. So
it was, I mean, I actually watched this video and I was a little, surprised about just how far that was the justification for why it was improper for them to just be reminding service members of what the law is, which is really what these videos, and obviously, by the way, their overreaction to this video has been a tell. It's been an authoritarian tell, right? Is that they have been so offended. I mean, Pete Hegseth today has now sort of said they may court-martial Senator Kelly, which of course is these idle threats that they often don't follow through on, right? But clearly it's affecting, I think, the preparation for this gambit in Venezuela, that this is starting to impact their ability to have this safety valve, right? Because getting back, what I wanted to say is that I think the incredible dynamic, I wrote about it a few weeks ago, calling the vicious cycle of a declining strongman. I sort of borrowed heavily from you and I referenced you in the piece, but it's that he has now got into a vicious cycle, which is that his poll numbers are collapsing. Everything that he does is sort of further driving down his poll numbers. His own Republicans now are beginning to freak out at the hole they've all put them in, because they all expect there to be elections next year, and they don't think they can. This guy's now an albatross, and it's going to be very difficult for them to run with him. You've seen these kind of heroic Marjorie Taylor Greene with this extraordinary break. You've seen Republicans really rally now to back Ukraine. You're starting to see him be more directly challenged. I mean, even obviously the vote last week, this 427-1. I mean, what a narcissistic injury that must have been to him, right, last week, and which is why I think you've seen him lash out. And even, frankly, the Mondami event in the White House was an insane event, right? Like not, it was, to me, a confirmation of his insanity as opposed to something that was charming or cute. But what we're running into is this sort of thing that's been looming, which is this state of emergency, this war that they've been kind of holding back. We just got CBS polling from yesterday showing that only 30% of Americans would support any kind of military action in Venezuela. And so all of a sudden now what he's running into is he's got this thing that he thinks is his way out that would obviously continue to drive him further and further away from the electorate if they actually try to execute this.
Yeah, and he's chosen the wrong thing, because, for example, this is not totally comparable, but when they did that missile strike against Iran on behalf of Netanyahu, all the Republicans and evangelicals were all for that because there's a narrative attached to it. We help Israel because it coincides with their holy war thing. And the evangelical Christian nationalist base is one of the, when we talk about autocracy, how they survive, how autocrats survive, they have these pillars, people who support them through thick and thin. And we know, obviously, that Christian nationalists, evangelicals, and non-denominational Christians are part of that very important pillar. And many of them, including Hegseth, we don't hear about this part of him enough, are holy warriors, and they will do anything to protect Israel. And so there was a narrative for that whole area of foreign policy. There was a narrative, but there's no narrative for Venezuela. Sure, he's a left-wing, horrible dictator. Everybody knows he's posing. It's a gangster state that poses as a regular state. But there's no narrative, and Americans are not invested or attached in any way to Venezuela. And so, and then also we have discontent of the public, but also within the military for what the military is being asked to do, both bombing boats and also being turned on civilians. This is a huge thing. And so we have read before this happened, this last episode you just described, that members of the military were getting legal advice about how do they refuse orders. So they know that there's discontent in the military already. There's been a couple of resignations, including the head of the Southern Command, because they don't want to be part of this. And the Quantico speech, which was it was an extreme speech. And basically, Hegseth announced, I followed it very closely, Hegseth announced that your hands are no longer tied, and you don't have to worry about the traditional rules of engagement. I wrote a lucid essay about it. It was a speech it was a programmatic speech for an authoritarian military. And a lot of people are not up for that. They're not up for having to repress civilians. And so he's got a big problem. He's got a big problem right now.
Well, and it is, he's got a lot of problems. I mean, what's interesting about what's happening is that he feels desperate and cornered and in decline and physical, part of it is also his powers, his physical and cognitive powers are ebbing to contribute. So Ruth, just game out, given where things are now, right? And how do you imagine the next few years for us? Because I think that for me, I've started writing about the fact that we have to start, sort of visualizing his departure, that this isn't working. It isn't objectively working, right? He's done enormous harm to the country. Republicans, I think, had polls, these fake polls that were sort of giving them false comfort that everything was fine. Well, all those have now turned wildly negative, and there's no hiding it. They've been sending out these memos these alarm memos coming from the Republican
Yeah.
pollsters, like, we're going to get killed. We just got killed in this election. Like, it's a disaster, right? And my own argument is that once all the legislatures and city councils all convene in January and have to deal with the wreckage that Trump has created, there's going to be months and months of public debate about all the harm that he's done to the country. That's going to, at a local level, that's going to amplify the national story. They know that this guy is an albatross. They know that he's a lame duck. They know that his powers are ebbing. They know that he's making irrational decisions and doing crazy things. What happens, do you think? I mean, I still am of the belief that you could start seeing prominent Republicans start to go on background, that, you've heard that Trump's his health isn't so good, because one way he gets out of this is by just claiming that he isn't, that he can't do the job any longer. He's got health issues and that he jumps out. Is your view that that's absurd and that, of course, he's going to stay into his dying day? Because I can tell you, as a political professional, right, who's somebody who's been in now, this is my 16th or 17th cycle, they don't want to run with him anymore. They're the political apparatus, the tens of thousands of Republicans all across the country that have to run in the elections in 2026, view Trump now as a problem and not as a leader to them. He's a failed leader to them. He took his shot and he failed. And this dynamic is, I think, going to become very, they have a very small majority in Congress, historically small majority in Congress. Could a formal kind of opposition start forming, bipartisan opposition, to sort of thwart his powers? Rand Paul just said that he thinks the Republican Party will rebel against any invasion of Venezuela. That was his prediction. Just help us think about how you think this is going to go, given where we are now.
Yeah, that's the most interesting question, and I think about it too. There's a lot to say here. This in general, the strongman personality, these people, the reason they're so repressive and blustery and is that they live in fear. And I have stuff in my book in the endings chapter about this if people are interested. Their nightmare is leaving office because they lose sometimes immunity from prosecution, they lose protection, they become vulnerable in a way that they're not normally. And their egos also, they have a maniacal need to dominate and humiliate others. We talked about this at the very beginning. And every occasion, every type of person, they live to humiliate others. They're just built differently than other people. I mean, how many people would think about that? It may seem like small and trivial thing, that AI video that Trump released right after the No Kings protests, where he is the all-powerful bomber who's literally crapping on the American people. He needed to do that to feel good. So this is not somebody who is likely to leave. And even if he's very greedy, as they all are, so even if he was offered some huge deal, he's already making so much money from the presidency. We don't even have an accounting. The New Yorker tried to make an accounting. So I'm not sure that money would move him. And so that's one issue. I'm not sure he would. I haven't seen any of them who leave voluntarily. The issue about Republicans rebelling, it could happen historically when you have a backing, when you have a party that's been domesticated and even made to forget that they were almost killed on January 6th. They've been completely humiliated, subjugated. There's a lot of stories. We don't hear enough about these stories. They're afraid for their lives. He's like a mob boss. This is Bill Emmett always calls him a gangster, the former head of The Economist. So I'm not sure how much they're going to openly rebel. I'm not sure about that, but I agree with your analysis of where we're going. And the last thing I'll say is 3 weeks after this nightmare started in February, I wrote an essay for Lucid that said, out of the chaos and corruption, a reckoning will come. And this is Hopium. So I'm an optimist. And I really did see that it was going to be so extreme and so accelerated, and it has been. There's no comparison with the first year of any autocracy where the person came in by elections. This has been like on steroids. It resembles more like after a coup or a revolution. It truly does. So I thought that a reckoning will come because the wreckage is going to be outsized and people will wake up. And we're seeing that happen. The ICE, people, ordinary people are coming out, and there's all kinds of things going on. And so I think that will increase. And if it gets to a point, it has enough momentum, then maybe the Republican elite will shift.
It's just from a data standpoint in the polling, it is just shocking how much he has lost his ability to persuade people about anything. You talk about the Iran bombing. I mean, what's been happening really, because his decline really started in June when Elon spent 3 days just in their breakup, when Elon, who had the ability to speak to MAGA people, right, which many of us don't have that ability to go in there, Elon emasculated him, right? Elon said that he needed to go and that J.D. Vance needed to come in and that he was in the Epstein files, and he really manhandled Trump in a way. And I think that from that day, and then the LA operation started just a couple of days later because he and Stephen Miller were both emasculated by Musk, if all the accounts are true about Musk and Stephen Miller's wife, and who knows, right?
Yeah.
But then they started acting out, right? And every time he's done one of these surprises, these strongman moves, they've been rejected by the American people, and he's grown more unpopular. I mean, that dynamic is in some ways among the most fascinating parts about what's happened, because I think they assumed that every time they did one of these things, the country would rally behind them. And in fact, if you look at his poll numbers, there's been no moment since the beginning of June where he has started going back up. It's been steady decline. And so all these things they've pulled out, right? And I think that, up until the election, I think they were able to bullshit their way to themselves, and with this false comfort that everything was going to be fine. The economy was actually doing much better. We just have to wait, right? But the election kind of blew it open. And it wasn't just the margins. I think part of what happened psychologically inside the Republican world was the margins in the New Jersey race were punishing to them. They believed that race was going to be competitive. They believed that Ciattarelli was even. Their polling, they had 7 pollsters in the last 2 weeks of the election saying the race was dead even, and she won by 13 points. And I think that race was sort of the bubble, one of the moments where the bubble burst, where all of a sudden things weren't fine with him. And I think that, so it's why this Venezuela thing, I think, is so significant, that we already have polling data showing 65-70% of the country already, right, before it's even happened. It's it's insane, right? I mean, and it's a sign of how much the country has rendered judgment on him. That 60-65-70% of the country has rendered judgment on him, and they want him. They're unhappy, deeply unhappy. They're pissed even. The intensity of the opposition is incredible. And so I think that, to your point, the acceleration, the way you described this, right, this incredible acceleration has created an incredible backlash in a country that has a long tradition of democracy, which many countries that you've studied don't, right? And it shows that there may be a greater and higher level of expectation about, we want a president, we don't want a dictator. We want a guy that doesn't tear down the East Wing. We want a guy that builds himself a gilded fucking ballroom, right? We want somebody who inspires us the way that other presidents have. And we didn't get that. And I think that people have grown to be really profoundly unhappy. And I will be honest with you, Ruth, I'm surprised at the level of intensity of opposition to him. I have been surprised about this as somebody who's been reading polling for over 30 years. It's deep, consequential, and I don't think he has the ability to reverse it.
No, there's 2 reasons. One is that this is truly a project to wreck America so thoroughly so holistically, education, health, public health, science, medicine, to just totally wreck it, so that it would take generations to recover. And people are starting to realize that. But more concretely, they also made a big error in picking Vance, who all the stakeholders, the Christian Nationalists, the Project 2025, the tech billionaires, and Peter Thiel. Remember that Peter Thiel both bankrolled Vance's Senate race and his private companies. So he's totally owned by Peter Thiel, who's, we all know about him. And Vance was the hope. He was supposed to carry American autocracy into the future, if Trump aged out or whatever. But he's totally unlikable. And you're the polling expert, but
Yeah.
I have seen some polls, and even independents, the only people who give him any positive rating at all are the MAGA diehards. Independents don't like him, so he's not electable. And so they've made an error in their arrogance. And this is the thing about authoritarians, and I'm including Russ Vought and Miller and all of the stakeholders. They're arrogant and they're fanatic, and they think they have the key to changing history. And they make unforced errors, and Vance was one of them.
I could talk to you literally all day, and the Vance thing, I'm gonna have to have you come back to talk about Vance, because I think we haven't spent enough time talking about Vance. One of the Peter Thiel and the Elon. I mean, just these tech bros and what's going to happen right over the next, as you project forward. One of the most interesting parts of the last few days has been the Rubio Vance. Because it looks now from reporting that Kushner and Wickoff that Vance was sort of the lead internally. The Army general, who's his buddy. I mean, the Army secretary is his buddy, was in the negotiations, but not Hegseth, right? And that Vance looked like he spearheaded this, not kept Rubio in the dark, as part of this early competition between the two of them for who's going to succeed Trump. And it is, and I agree with you that I think Vance has made is incredibly odious and not likable. The issue about what's going to happen with him and his wife is this other really complex thing. But anyway, I don't want to take up any. I want you to come back to talk about Vance, because I think Vance is fascinating, and I think the chance of him taking over for Trump at some point before the 4 years is increased in likelihood. It doesn't mean the reason. Let me just say this, is that one of the things that in my own work, in my own thinking, I try very, very hard, and this is why I wanted you to come on today, because I wrestle and struggle with the sane and the insane, right? In essence, right? That I often talk about at Hopium that we can't let his insanity become our own, right? That we can't let him have that power over us. I mean, he's even now, blowing up Thanksgiving, right? Because he's so, his need to be the center of attention in the world at all times is so overwhelming and such a driving force for him. But I think that the thing that I try to not let go of is that the majority of the country is still operating as if we're a democracy and as if there is sanity and the sky is blue, and that, and while he may not be operating in that world any longer, that he was living in the world that Greg Sargent once called Foxlandia, right? This imaginary world that he's created, where he's young and virile and svelte and Superman and not, a global villain. That we have to be disciplined to also not go there ourselves, right? And to not go into that place and to stay in the place of reality. And in the place of reality, of the way that elections have run and political parties have run, inside his party, Donald Trump is in a lot of trouble right now. And I don't know, and my own view is that this wasn't Trump, that the talk about him needing to step down or move on or to find something else would be much louder than it is, in part because he's also just so obviously in ill health in addition to everything else, right? And, the mystery MRI, which was one of my favorite Trump moments the last few weeks. He didn't know what part of his body the MRI happened in, which was like one of the greatest ridiculous Trump moments, is that, But I think that the gravity of what's happening inside the political world, and I shared this story today from Punchbowl News, which is, by the way, of all the kind of insidery publications, I think they're doing the best reporting on the internal MAGA stuff in the House and Senate. I often find their stuff to be the most illuminating. Is they had a report this morning where they interviewed a House member who used extraordinary language to describe, unnamed House member, describe the meltdown that was happening, and that they were growing aware now that there would be a high likelihood that there could be more retirements like Marjorie Taylor Greene, which would deny them the majority and turn the majority over to the Democrats, that could happen this next year, that the idea that that is something that could happen is growing in likelihood and socialization inside their world. And this is in like something that everybody reads in Washington in the morning, right? Where all of a sudden this notion that they're the edifices or the pillars of his power could start collapsing are now being openly discussed, which, as you know, is really important, right? Because they read it in the White House and they go fucking insane, and it causes them to lash out. And so we're in a fascinating period here. And part of what in my advice I've been giving to the House and Senate Democrats is that we need to do everything we can to try to break off, the four that broke off and did the repeal of the tariffs back in October. That was a big deal. We voted 3 times to repeal the tariffs. We saw this huge vote that just happened in the House on Epstein. If we can get a discharge petition that passes next week when they come back here on what happened with Russia and Ukraine, and it actually passes the House, Trump will have gone through now sort of a series of extraordinary repudiations and humiliations that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago or 4 months ago. And I think the question is, can we create more momentum so that the idea of a discharge petition starts to become routine? My own hope is that I do hope they get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, because I think it will force them to own their agenda and not to have Democrats give them any cover for what they're doing. They're starting to really struggle with the wreckage, to use your term, that Trump has created. And I just, as somebody who's been in this, I think that they are really starting to go through a collective panic that is incredible. And it could be a far bigger problem for Trump in the White House than they understand.
Yeah, well, the old resistance maxim is that when you unite together, when you come together, you have power. And if these people had come together, say January 7th, 2021, anyway, it's like I would like to say I have no sympathy because they've been the cowardice and really, when we think back, having had to run for their lives, Republicans and everybody had to run for their lives, their staffers, some of these people were 30 seconds away from being harmed. And then they were required by the personality cult to forget all of it and still trot out and be loyal to him. So they debased themselves. So better late than never. If they start figuring it out and come to life, I will be very pleased for our democracy.
And I guess that's what the core of Hopium, which is that, that we know that there's only so many ways we get through to the other side here, right? And one of them, the most important, and I'll let you go, Ruth, but one of them is that his decline in popularity has been an essential, necessary, insufficient, but necessary step. The next is if we can organize some kind of significant structural break. They have very small majorities. To your point about arrogance, they've been operating as if they've got 70% of Congress. I think to see I always felt, and I've written about this, that the reason I think they've been dancing around this Russia stuff, and I'll let you go because we're at time, but is that they knew they were really at odds with Republicans in the House and Senate on this. And that, there were 85 co-sponsors of the Russian sanctions bill. And so this was something they couldn't go there because the potential for backlash among Republicans was always far more significant than it was on all these other issues. And they've gone there. And we're about to see what's going to happen now, right? Where if this becomes sort of this, because again, I don't think it's a straw that breaks the camel's back. I describe it as the circle of defiance grows, right? Where people have more courage to defy, and that creates this sort of vicious dynamic for them. I think we're about to see something significant, I hope, next week. And I think that Democrats, we need to be thinking about how to foster this and encourage this, and not view it as their thing. It's our thing, and to build this opposition. And that requires skills that aren't necessarily the same skills that you need to win elections or to govern your caucus. And we need continued creativity and ambition in our leaders now at a time of enormous crisis for the country. Ruth, I'm sorry, but I went on too long. You're amazing. Thank you so much for being here today. And everyone, you can buy her book, Strongman. I have it. It's in my shelf back here. Also subscribe to Lucid. It's a phenomenal Substack. And where Ruth writes and has guests and, similar to Hopium. And it's just a tremendous place of inspiration for me. And just thank you for your patriotism and for your fight. This is, as you know, there's a big difference between writing about all of this and then diving in. And, you have gone in all feet, all arms, the whole body is in this fight, Ruth. And we're just grateful to have you in this fight with all of us.
Thank you. I've learned so much from you as well. You'll have to come on Lucid and we'll continue our discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. And if you like this, please hit like, subscribe to Hopium and to Ruth's amazing work at Lucid. And keep working hard, folks. We've had a good few weeks and we need to make the next few weeks even better. Take care.